The Great American Desert, later known as the frontier, was not a land awaiting settlement and civilization as it was thought. In fact, the mid-19th century West was a diverse land, with many different people, regions, climates, and many different stores of natural resources. Also, it was already highly populated. Indian tribes were the largest and most important Western population group before the Great American Migration. Tribes' cultures were based on close and extended family networks. The most widespread Indian groups were the Plains Indians. Plain tribes rarely had permanent settlements. They instead constructed teepees as temporary dwellings, leaving land almost undisturbed after they departed. Unlike other societies in the West, these natives also hunted buffalo or bison. Buffalo and bison are huge grazing animals that provided the economic basis for the Plains Indians. Pueblo Indians of the Southwest lived as farmers in permanent settlements, and like Plains Indians, Pueblos grew corn, built towns and cities of adobe houses, had irrigation, and participated in trade and commerce. The intimate relationship between West tribes and Hispanics during the 18th and 19th century produced an alliance against a common threat, the Apaches and Navajos of the region. In the 1840s, land taken from Mexico had a considerable number of Mexicans which stayed and became residents of American territory. Hispanic communities were scattered throughout the Southwest. These communities were shaped in varying degrees by the arrival of Anglo-American migrants, and by the expansion of the American capitalist economy. Both Hispanics and Indians feared that the American rulers of the region would threaten their societies. Hispanic societies, however, were preserved because they were not centered within English-speaking societies. The Army broke the power of the Navajo and Apache tribes, which led to substantial Hispanic migration. Most migration involved peasants and small tradespeople who looked for land and opportunity in commerce. Californios, the name given to Hispanics living in California, faced the same if not worse treatment than they did in New Mexico. Hispanics were excluded from the mines during the gold rush by Anglo-Americans. Also in the 1860s, Mexicans and Mexican-Americans became part of the lower working class of California, clustered in barrios, poor Hispanic neighborhoods. In Texas, Hispanics faced the loss of their lands after Texas joined the United States. All of this because of fraud and inability to compete with Anglo-American ranching kingdoms. Another group of immigrants was the Chinese. Chinese immigrants crossed the Pacific in hopes of better lives than what they could expect from their own poverty-stricken land. The Chinese not only came to the United States, however, many went to Hawaii, Australia, Latin America, South Africa, and even the Caribbean as coolies. Coolies were indentured servants, whose condition was close to slavery. Immigrants from China had come to California before the gold rush, but the migration increased in 1848, and by the 1880s more than 200,000 Chinese lived in the United States, most in California. For a time, Americans appreciated the Chinese because of their hard work, but that changed as Americans started to think of them as rivals and threats. America took action, and in 1852 the foreign miners' tax was enacted. This excluded both Chinese and Mexicans from mines. Mining failed as a source of wealth to the Chinese, but jobs in the railroad came in. In 1865 over 12,000 Chinese found work building the Transcontinental Railroad. At the time, Chinese formed 90% of the labor force of the Central Pacific. Chinatowns and secret societies known as tongs were developed. Some tongs were violent and criminal organizations involved in opium trade. Opium is an addictive narcotic drug obtained from opium poppy seeds. Because of Chinese success, anti-Chinese sentiments broke among white residents. In the 1860s and 70s, anti-coolie clubs came out looking for the ban of Chinese employment. By the mid-1880s, anti-Chinese agitation and violence spread up and down the Pacific coast and into other areas of the West. Resentments were not purely economic. Boo rested on cultural and racial arguments. Due to political pressure and the growing violence toward the Chinese, the government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act that banned Chinese immigration to the United States for 10 years. It also barred Chinese already in the country from naturalization. The act was first passed in 1882, then renewed in 1892 and became permanent in 1902. Most Anglo-American settlers had established in California and Oregon and in Texas, and from Texas to New Mexico, Arizona and other areas of the Southwest. The Homestead Act of 1862 permitted settlers to buy plots of 160 acres for a small fee if they occupied the land for 5 years and improved it. Almost everything the Anglo-Americans did and built reflected the influence of Indian, Hispanic, and Chinese cultures, as well as French, British, and Canadian cultures. Anglo-American migration was less catastrophic for Hispanics than it was for the Indian tribes and the Chinese immigrants. This, with the introduction of the capitalist economy, strained cultural and racial arguments due to employment competition, which ultimately resulted in the exclusion and dislocation of anyone not Anglo-American.